It is said that there was a medieval monk who could memorize an entire library, classify hundreds of species of plants and minerals, and explain the movements of the stars when Europe was still immersed in superstition. Why would someone living in the 13th century understand the universe with a level of accuracy that modern science finds astonishing? And how could a poor monk of the Dominican order become the Doctor Universalis, the one who laid the foundation for Christian natural science? Saint Albert the Great left more than 40 bodies of works, paving the way for Saint Thomas Aquinas and marking the turning point where reason and faith meet. His story is not only an academic journey, but also a journey that leads humanity toward the light of the Creator. Before we begin, please leave an Amen in the comments to join in prayer. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel to watch more moving stories about the saints. Every like and comment from you is a small act of sharing that helps the video reach more people, so that together we may contemplate the lives of the saints and be inspired to live more holy lives each day. 13th century Europe appears as a canvas covered by the grey tones of chaos and limitation. Cities still bore the marks of war, rural lands were steeped in fear because of disease, and long nights were empty of knowledge. In that atmosphere, people looked to the sky without finding answers to the movements of the universe, and looked to the earth without understanding the life quietly growing within each root. The world seemed held at the threshold of understanding, not strong enough to step into an age of science, and not bright enough to open a new language for faith. That atmosphere created a sense of waiting, as if history stood still to welcome a new path, where those whose hearts were prepared could recognize another way through the fog of the age. In that context, in the town of Lauingen by the Danube, in the year 1206, a family welcomed a son named Albert. No one knew that this child would grow into a sage of Europe, nor could anyone imagine that his journey would create a path linking knowledge and holiness. On the day Albert was born, the sky recorded no sign, yet from the perspective of faith, a quiet seed had been planted that would one day become a light for a world seeking to understand the Creator within the very matter he had formed. Lauingen remained calm as always, but what was quietly entrusted to that family held a meaning beyond the boundaries of time. The years of youth led Albert into Dominican life, and the image of the young man entering the monastery became one of the silent milestones that history still remembers. There were no trumpets, no sudden marks, only the quiet of a soul turned toward the light of truth. Albert came to Dominican life like a traveler, seeking a resting place for his intellectual longing. Within the monastery, amid prayers and candlelight, he began to see the world through different eyes, where each leaf, each star, and each stone became an invitation to enter the depth of creation. This was no longer the path of a young man eager to learn, but a sacred journey unfolding in the silence of prayer, where knowledge and contemplation joined as two rhythms of the same breath. As Albert sought the meaning of creation, the world around him still struggled with unanswered questions. People of that time easily assigned the mysteries of nature to the incomprehensible or the frightening, and few dared to pursue the full reading of the book of creation with reason. In that setting, Albert's silence became unusual, not as an escape, but as a turning toward the source of truth's light. Many centuries later, people would speak of him as the Doctor Universalis, the great intellect of the Church, the father of Christian natural science, but at this moment, in the small room of the Cologne monastery, Albert was simply a young monk, opening each page of knowledge with a humble heart. When candlelight shimmered across the surface of the old wooden desk, a question seemed to rise into the space. How could a poor monk become the one who laid the foundation for natural science, the one who dared to bring human knowledge closer to the mystery of God? That question not only opens the story of the film, but also opens the journey into the very heart of Saint Albert the Great. From the darkness of the age, from the simple beginnings of childhood, from the quiet steps leading into Dominican life, a primordial light was rising. That light would become a guiding star for the centuries to come, forming a legacy marked by human intellect and shaped by the depth of a life offered entirely to God. Europe entered the 13th century with major transformations in intellectual life. New translations of Aristotle from the Arab world were introduced into the classrooms, overturning how people understood nature and themselves. Monks, professors, and students in Paris began debating the relationship between reason and revelation, between ancient philosophy and Christian teaching. Many viewed the strong return of Aristotle as a strange wind that could unsettle an already stable theology. Concepts of cause, substance, matter, and form opened a new horizon, but also stirred fears that pagan thought could lead people away from faith. In the monasteries, that concern echoed like the voice of a world still unable to find harmony between classical heritage and belief in the Creator. In that atmosphere, the Church faced an unprecedented challenge. If it rejected the new philosophy, the Church would separate itself from the intellectual development of humanity. If it accepted it without discernment, the danger of falling into heresy became real. The world needed someone capable of seeing the truth in each field without losing the orientation toward God. A mind able to look at natural science through the eyes of faith and see theology with the clarity of reason. That need was not only the need of the academy but also of an entire society trying to understand the world in two seemingly opposing languages. A person who could reconcile those tensions would become a bridge between two shores that were drifting apart, the shore of reason and the shore of revelation. The Dominican order, founded only a few decades earlier, rose as a gathering place for souls thirsting for truth. This was a religious order that emphasized study and teaching, where the friars were invited to contemplate so they could share that light with the world. In the Dominican studia, knowledge did not stand apart from prayer, and the study of philosophy was not separate from faith. It was in that atmosphere that the seed of the genius of Saint Albert the Great was nurtured. When he took his first steps into Dominican life, he encountered not only an ascetic way of living, but also an intellectual tradition capable of supporting his desire for truth. The monasteries were not only places of prayer, but also forges of ideas capable of transforming all of Europe. On the roads leading to Paris, the intellectual center of the age, a quiet transformation was unfolding. Crowded classes of students, long debates among masters, and Arabic manuscripts newly translated into Latin all contributed to shaping a new academic environment. When St. Albert the Great arrived there, Europe began to witness something unusual. While many worried about the rise of pagan philosophy, Albert saw in it a key that could help humanity understand more clearly the work of God's creation. He read Aristotle not to distance himself from faith, but to explore the depth of the natural order established by God. His calm and clarity became the first signs that he would not follow the beaten path of fear, but would open a path of dialogue. From Paris to Cologne, the footsteps of St. Albert the Great, stretched across places considered the heart of Western intellectual life. Every place he went became the starting point of a shift in how people approached knowledge. He did not see science as a threat, but as a sacred journey in which the intellect moved toward the source of all existence. That way of thinking helped his students and contemporaries realize that science and faith were not two parallel roads moving in different directions, but two streams of light meeting in the mystery of God. Because of this, his presence became a fresh breeze, blowing into lecture halls already filled with tension. In the complex flow of the 13th century, St. Albert the Great entered as a bridge, connecting realities once thought irreconcilable. The age needed him, because he carried within himself a balance between intellect and faith, between philosophy and theology, between natural observation and spiritual contemplation. When the world still feared science, he recognized that creation was a gift God offered so humanity could begin the journey of knowing him. And from that recognition, Albert's path became a point of encounter between humanity and the Creator, opening a new chapter for both the Church and Western science. Amid the waves of intellectual change in the 13th century, the journey of St. Albert the Great began with a longing so intense that it made him seem isolated among his contemporaries. While many scholars used reason as a shield to defend themselves against what they did not yet understand, for Albert, reason became a gateway that opened to wonder before the world. He read Aristotle with admiration, as if each line were a bridge leading back to the origins of creation. When he walked through the fields of his homeland, Lauingen, he bent down to observe the structure of a branch, the color of a leaf, and the soft layers of soil beneath his feet. Every detail was an invitation to go deeper into the order God had arranged. Although no one understood why a young man would spend hours looking at stones by the riverbank, he quietly continued to pursue that hunger for knowledge, as if the entire world were whispering to his young mind. Those years carried the first whispers of suspicion. When St. Albert the Great paused in the night to observe the trail of a star, some people clicked their tongues and saw it as odd. When they saw him take notes on the shapes of flowers, on streams of water, on the movement of insects, some believed it was a useless passion. They called him a pursuer of the mysterious, a man with interests unlike anyone else. In a society that tied knowledge to scholastic theology and academic privilege, the idea of a monk spending many hours each day studying nature seemed strange. But St. Albert the Great continued quietly, like one who knew that his calling did not lie in seeking human approval, but in remaining faithful to the light quietly shining within. The rumors of the age could not stop the rhythm of a soul hungry for truth. When he entered the Cologne monastery, his path entered a deeper dimension. By day, he was a teacher who taught scripture and theological foundations. By night, under the warm glow of candles, his small room became a place of dialogue with the knowledge of the ancient world. While the other monks ended their day with rest, St. Albert the Great began another journey. He opened Aristotle's text, compared it with the Arabic translation, and then recorded his reflections beside each concept. In one corner of the room, mineral samples were arranged in order next to sketches of plant structures. That small room contained a quiet universe where knowledge and contemplation blended in the same flame. Those long nights carried an indescribable solitude. One who goes ahead of his time always stands at the boundary between understanding and doubt. St. Albert the Great felt this clearly when his questions were not always accompanied by companions. Many nights he stopped, laid down his pen, and looked at the flickering candlelight, asking himself whether he was venturing too far into the unexplored. But in that silence, an inner strength appeared again, like a small stream slipping through stone, helping him stand firm in solitude. That perseverance did not come from human willpower, but was the fruit of prayer, where St. Albert the Great listened to God's guidance in each step. That journey could not avoid trials born from knowledge itself. He realized that intellect could become a temptation, especially when a person wanted to possess truth rather than receive it as a gift. St. Albert the Great entered a quiet battle between the desire to understand and the call to reflect. He learned to let reason serve faith, to let the study of nature become an act of praise to the one who created the order of the universe. The pages of theology, the lines of prayer, and the scientific notes flowed together within him like two rivers moving toward one ocean, that is God. That inner discipline helped him remain free in his research, not allowing knowledge to harden, but letting it become a bridge to encounter the Creator. In the years when his mind expanded beyond what anyone could keep up with, St. Albert the Great still knew that the path of seeking truth was the path of humility. He understood that no philosophy and no scientific discovery could fully express the glory of God. The only thing a person could do was walk step by step in the light given, with gratitude and steadiness. In that spirit, he continued his journey like a tireless traveler. The trials of the age, the doubts of others, and the solitude of a pioneer all became material that shaped his heart. The human journey of St. Albert the Great was not an easy road. He lived in the loneliness of one who knew more than his era allowed, faced the caution of those unfamiliar with science, and endured long nights by candlelight like someone finding his way in silence. Yet through every event, he moved forward with the conviction that God was calling him into the depths of creation. The quiet battle between knowledge and faith did not extinguish the light in his soul. On the contrary, that very battle formed the sage of the Church, whom history would call Saint Albert the Great. Before coming to the next section, I wish to share one small thing. This channel was made for those who cherish the saints and want to contemplate and practice the spiritual legacy they left. If you are interested in these themes, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss any videos. May God's grace, through the intercession of the saints, be poured abundantly upon all brothers and sisters who have liked this video. Thank you very much. Now, without further delay, let us move on to the main part. In the gentle morning light of the monastery in Cologne, a sacred intuition began to take shape in the mind of Saint Albert the Great. He observed each petal opening and closing in the mist, the shapes of leaves, the veins on tree trunks, and realized that nature was not only the backdrop of human life, but an open book written in order and beauty. Creation was woven from the loving intention of God, so studying creation did not lead people away from faith, but guided them toward the light of the One who made all things. That intuition did not arrive suddenly, but as the fruit of many years of contemplation, of the blending between intellect and silence. He felt as though God was inviting him into a new dialogue in which nature spoke its own language and reason became a bridge to reach the Creator through his own work. The unity between faith and science unfolded not through a vision but through patient daily effort. St. Albert the Great quietly observed the structure of plants, the traces of animals, and the movement of the stars. Every detail was recorded with reverence, as though he were reading each verse of a cosmic psalm. From this emerged a new method of study, though not yet named, that carried the full spirit of empirical science: observation, classification, description, and verification. He did not stop at abstract ideas, but brought knowledge down to the soil, into the forests, into the streams, and the ground bursting with life. St. Albert the Great became the first to bring precision into the study of nature, laying the foundation for science centuries later. That method surprised many because he did not see knowledge as a fixed block of information, but as an unfolding process. He explained minerals through detailed descriptions and analyzed stones by their properties and colors. He studied living creatures by grouping them, paying attention to body structure, habitat, and the survival abilities of each species. Regarding meteorological phenomena, he carefully noted changes in wind, clouds, and humidity, and related them to shifts in the seasons. Each observation became an act of prayer, not only because it pointed toward knowledge, but because it led toward a deeper source of truth. Creation became the language God used to reveal himself, and St. Albert the Great learned to read it with humility. This allowed him to face Aristotle with a renewed spirit. When teaching in Paris, St. Albert the Great did not see Aristotle as a threat, but as a companion in exploring the world. He analyzed Aristotle's theses on cause, substance, and motion, then placed them in relation to Christian faith. Instead of rejecting Greek thought, he purified it with the light of revelation, showing that reason could serve faith when rightly directed. In the lecture halls of Paris, where heated debates took place, he became a calm voice between two extremes: the caution of those who feared pagan thought and the self-confidence of those who revered ancient philosophy too greatly. In his teachings, St. Albert the Great opened the door for philosophy to be understood in its true nature. He emphasized that Aristotle had reached many natural truths, but faith brought knowledge to a height that reason alone could not attain. He showed that philosophy did not overshadow theology, but helped theology express the mystery of God more profoundly. From that reconciliation, a new foundation for medieval theology was formed. The presence of Saint Albert the Great transformed Paris into a place where knowledge was no longer a battlefield between science and faith, but fertile ground for the encounter between these two lights. During those years of teaching, a young student entered Saint Albert the Great's classroom and became a figure who would change history. This was Saint Thomas Aquinas, who would later compose the most extensive theological system of the Middle Ages. While many saw Thomas as a quiet, reserved student, somewhat slow in expression, Saint Albert the Great perceived in his eyes a growing interior depth. He supported Thomas with the respect due to a searching mind and gave him research principles that helped the student enter the heights of Christian thought. Saint Albert the Great often said that his vocation was not to build a philosophical system, but to open a path for others to go farther. His life was like a gentle river, carrying water to the sea while keeping nothing for himself of what he had discovered. Because of this, Saint Thomas Aquinas became the one who continued and brought the Church's knowledge to maturity. The statement that the disciple would surpass the master was not merely humility, but the understanding that truth does not stop in one person, but continues to expand through souls open to the light of God. Those years marked a major turning point in the life of Saint Albert the Great. The unity between knowledge and faith was no longer a private intuition, but became a mission. He realized that God was calling him to guide a new generation, those who would use reason as a doorway into the divine mystery. Every work he wrote, every lecture he gave, bore the mark of his conviction that truth lay in the harmony between creation and the Creator. Saint Albert the Great not only contributed to transforming science, but also shaped the way the Church understood the material world for many centuries. From the initial sacred intuition, through persistent observation and study, to teaching and passing that spirit on to Saint Thomas Aquinas, the life of Saint Albert the Great became a witness to the possibility of encounter between humanity and God within the very order of creation. This was the mysterious moment in which knowledge was sanctified, where reason and faith held each other and stepped into the wide sky of truth. This path would lead him to even greater missions, where the light of God continued to accompany each step he took. In the shifting rhythm of the 13th century, when thought and spirituality had reached maturity, Saint Albert the Great was invited to enter a path completely different from what he had ever chosen. In 1260, Pope Urban IV appointed him Bishop of Ratisbon, a diocese falling into disorder and in need of a steady hand. That decision came when Saint Albert the Great was living peaceful days of study and prayer. His heart leaned toward the silence of the monastery, rather than carrying the responsibility of leading a diocese. Yet, obedience to the will of the Church became the first sign that his intellect was not separate from pastoral life. When he received the mission, he did not see it as an interruption in his study, but as an invitation to live knowledge as a higher form of service, where faith and gentleness were expressed through action. When he arrived in Ratisbon, Saint Albert the Great faced a deeply divided diocese. The spiritual life of clergy in many places had weakened, local power groups competed for influence, and the liturgical atmosphere lacked the solemnity it should have had. In that situation, he did not apply harsh measures or introduce reforms too quickly that might break an already fragile structure. Instead, he walked with the gentleness of a shepherd, using calmness to listen to the difficulties of clergy and laity. With deep insight into people and society, Saint Albert the Great restored spiritual discipline by leading everyone back to the source of their vocation, not through coercion, but through love for God. The reform of liturgical life became a clear point of renewal. He guided the diocese back to reverence and order, emphasizing that liturgy was not only a duty, but a living encounter between humanity and God. Gradually, the celebrations regained their original beauty, with the refinement of prayer and the stillness of the community. Alongside this, civil disputes, which brought dissatisfaction and division, were reconciled by his perseverance and compassion. Not everyone understood his method, But over time, people realized that the diocese was regaining peace once thought lost. The 3 short years of his episcopal mission became a period many considered a quiet miracle, for the strength of gentleness restored what had been torn down. After stabilizing the diocese, Saint Albert the Great asked to resign and return to Dominican life. That decision astonished the Ratisbon community. While many saw the episcopacy as the summit of service, Saint Albert the Great viewed it as one stage in the journey of following God's will. He left authority without hesitation, returning to the monastery in his simple habit, living in poverty, and stepping back into the familiar rhythm of prayer. That renunciation did not reduce his influence. On the contrary, it deepened the image of a shepherd who did not seek honor, but lived the true nature of one called to serve. After leaving the diocese, Saint Albert the Great continued to serve the Church in many other ways. He participated in the Second Council of Lyon, a major event of the 13th century that addressed Christian unity and reforms in various aspects of consecrated life. In this council, Saint Albert the Great was seen as the voice of wisdom, offering discernment that helped the Church maintain balance between tradition and the need for renewal. For him, unity did not lie in imposition, but in turning together toward the light of truth. His journeys became a testimony to a life fully consecrated. Saint Albert the Great did not ride horses or use special means reserved for someone who had once been a bishop. He walked across many lands, carrying light baggage and an open heart. Those who met him on the road described an elderly monk with a simple appearance, walking with the serenity of one living within his vocation. He visited monasteries, communities, and places torn by conflict to help people rediscover reconciliation. His presence carried no sense of authority, but the presence of peace, like a gentle stream softening the sharp edges within wounded hearts. On those journeys, Saint Albert the Great always united intellectual life with pastoral life. His great works, from theology to science, did not remain in his study, but became a source of strength, guiding those who sought truth. He brought knowledge into the service of people by helping them see truth in concrete life. Those who met him recounted that spending only a short time with him brought clarity of mind and peace of heart, as if his intellect existed not only to teach, but also to soothe and guide. For Saint Albert the Great, the fruit of faith was not found in grand achievements, but in the ability to turn knowledge into action that brought peace. From thinker to shepherd, from teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas to reconciler in divided lands, his path showed that sanctified intellect could transform a community without the need for force. His journey united 2 dimensions, the height of thought and the depth of service. Saint Albert the Great lived episcopal life as a contemplative and lived contemplative life as a shepherd. In that harmony, the Church recognized in him a rare example. He did not withdraw from the world to seek truth, but sought truth to return to the world, carrying a light capable of guiding those confused by the turbulence of the age. When looking back at the 3 years in the Ratisbon diocese and the long years of service afterward, people realized that the strength of Saint Albert the Great did not come from authority or status. It came from a heart soaked in God's light, an intellect humble before mystery, and a life always open to peace. Those fruits did not fade with time, but became a living testimony to a journey of faith that united knowledge and love into a complete mission. As the pastoral journey of Saint Albert the Great extended across lands and generations of students, his interior life maintained a distinct rhythm, a rhythm nourished by silent contemplation. In the early mornings of the monasteries where he stayed, bird song broke into the quiet air, the first light spread across the rooftops, and Saint Albert the Great stepped into the small courtyard with a peaceful soul open to the simple beauty of creation. Each falling leaf on the ground, each stone resting beneath his feet, each flowing stream became a sign of an order that God had established. For him, contemplation did not remain within the chapel but extended into every fiber of the world, because creation was the place where God left the imprint of his love and power. Looking at nature, He did not stop at delight, but entered a deeper encounter in which intellect and heart moved together toward the Creator. From those silent observations, a distinct spirituality took shape, in which science was not separate from prayer, but became a form of praise. When Saint Albert the Great studied the structure of stones, when he recorded the classification of plants, or when he observed the movement of celestial bodies, he did not see these as human attempts to conquer knowledge. He saw them as acts of thanksgiving, because each natural law and each order beneath the surface chaos was a way in which God revealed himself. His awe before creation led him into a deep spiritual state in which knowledge became a light, lifting the soul toward the one who created all causes. In the world he explored, he did not see randomness, but the silent presence of God guiding the universe in harmony. That conviction led Saint Albert the Great to unite intellect with interior silence. Whenever he completed an observation, recorded something new, or discovered a hidden structure, he did not rush to interpret it, but quietly returned to the chapel. In the space of candlelight and prayer, he knelt before the statue of Christ to ask for discernment. He understood that reason, no matter how sharp, still needed to be placed in the light of grace. Those hours of prayer became the foundation that helped him keep his mind clear and humble. Saint Albert the Great knew that truth was not something one seizes, but something God grants to those who seek with an open heart. Through that union, science did not dry out his spirituality, and spirituality did not distance his knowledge from reality. Those who lived close to Saint Albert the Great recounted that his gentleness spread naturally like a warm breeze. Although respected throughout Europe, invited to teach in major universities and to participate in important councils, he lived like a simple friar in daily life. He chose the most modest portion at meals, chose the darkest corner in the dormitory, and kept the habit of cleaning his room like a novice. When people called him Doctor Universalis, his heart was not moved by the honor. Deep within, he knew he was only a traveler on the path of truth, where every discovery was a gift, and every insight pointed toward the one who gave meaning to all things. In the final years of his life, when age slowed his steps and his intellect no longer shone as in youth, that gentleness became even more evident. Saint Albert the Great spent long hours in prayer, reflecting on the graces he had received and the doors of knowledge that had opened not through his own strength, but through God's guidance. He looked back on his life like a long river in which research, teaching, and ministry intertwined in a single journey, the journey toward the light. Those who came to see him in that period did not find regret or pride, but encountered a soul shaped by prayer and humility. In all the reflections of Saint Albert the Great, one constant was his profound gratitude for creation. He believed that God did not make the world as a place where humans must struggle to understand, but as a place where they could encounter his love through the harmony of every detail. For him, each scientific discovery was a step that brought humanity closer to God, and each hour of prayer opened a new way of seeing the universe. This was the spirituality of one who knew that nothing lay outside the hands of the Creator, and no truth existed outside his light. The inner light of Saint Albert the Great did not arise from extreme asceticism or extraordinary visions, but from the union of contemplation and knowledge, of humility and longing, of intellectual effort and absolute trust in God. He lived like a gentle traveler, yet his journey became an inspiration for generations. In the quiet of the monastery, amid prayer and the movement of nature, his spirituality shone like an unending flame, illuminating the path for those who seek truth in the beauty of creation and in the mystery of God. As the journey of Saint Albert the Great entered its final years, the intellectual world of Europe recognized in him a light that surpassed ordinary boundaries. His intellect did not fade with age, but became like a flame refined through decades of prayer and study. People of his time spoke of his memory, an ability that astonished many scholars. Thick books, the pages of Aristotle, and philosophical texts were not burdens but streams flowing through his mind. People believed that God had granted him a special grace of illumination so he could grasp and discern knowledge so vast that an entire lifetime could scarcely contain it. That extraordinary gift did not create distance, but instead made Saint Albert the Great a foundation for many generations. Students sought him not only to hear his lectures, but to experience the peace that radiated from the soul of a holy sage. Those who lived near him recounted that although his intellect embraced many fields of science, he remained simple in every word and action. That light was not the light of self-satisfaction, but of one who understood that knowledge was a gift meant to lead others closer to God. Among the spiritual signs passed down across centuries is the bond between Saint Albert the Great and Saint Thomas Aquinas. What they shared was not merely knowledge, but the harmony of two souls guided by God along the path of truth. On the day Saint Thomas Aquinas died, while teaching in Cologne, Saint Albert the Great suddenly stopped, tears falling in silence. He told his students that Thomas had returned to God. No one had brought the news, but a profound intuition in the teacher's heart sounded like a call from the sacred realm. Many generations have considered that event a sign beyond natural ability, a connection God granted to two giants of intellect and faith. If you want to learn more about the life of Saint Thomas Aquinas, visit my channel. I have placed the video at the top. The final years of Saint Albert the Great in Cologne bore a quiet beauty. Though elderly and slower in step, he preserved his rhythm of prayer and study. On his desk lay unfinished manuscripts and quick notes written in the dim light of evening. He continued to teach until his strength no longer allowed it, and every lecture carried the wisdom gathered from a life deeply united with God. Many young monks traveled to Cologne seeking his advice or simply to sit in silence in the monastery courtyard, where his passing shadow felt like an invitation to live with humility and intellect. In those final afternoons, as the sun glowed red over the old monastery tiles of Cologne, Saint Albert the Great spent more time in prayer. He looked back on the long path he had walked, from Lauingen to Paris, from the lively halls of study to the quiet years of his final autumn. All had been woven by God's hand. On 15 November 1280, Saint Albert the Great returned to the one he had sought all his life. His death carried a deep peace, like a river that had completed its course and reached a wider ocean. After Saint Albert the Great passed away, the fame of his holiness and intellect spread beyond the borders of Germany. Blessings received through his intercession were recorded in many documents from Dominican communities and lay faithful in Cologne, Paris, and Ratisbonne. His scholarly works continued to inspire generations of scholars and theologians. People saw in him not only a scientist, but a model of the perfect union between reason and faith. In 1622, the Church beatified Saint Albert the Great to acknowledge the spiritual fruits he left behind. And in 1931, Pope Pius XI canonized him and declared him a Doctor of the Church, a title reserved for minds that changed the direction of the Church and helped build the theological foundation of humanity. That title was given not because he wrote much, but because every page carried the harmony between the light of science and the light of faith. Today, the legacy of Saint Albert the Great remains a lamp for all who seek truth. People remember him as the one who laid the foundation for Christian natural science, the one who built a bridge between creation and the Creator, between intellect and contemplation. The light of his life has never dimmed. It continues to shine as a testimony that God walks with humanity in every small detail of the universe and in every effort of the mind, seeking to return to the eternal light. Looking back on the journey of Saint Albert the Great, the soul of the believer pauses before a vast tapestry woven from intellect, prayer, and silent surrender. His life unfolded like a long hymn of faithfulness, in which knowledge did not stand against faith, but became the path that brought humanity closer to the Creator. Each of his steps on German soil, each manuscript page in the monasteries of Paris or Cologne, reflected the harmony between natural observation and divine contemplation. He showed the world that exploring creation was not only an activity of reason, but an act of honoring God, the one who set beauty and order in every star and every vein of the earth. The legacy of St. Albert the Great lay not only in the treasury of knowledge he left behind, but also in the manner of life of a pilgrim of truth. Though honored across Europe, he always kept the heart of a gentle friar who knew that knowledge became true light only when rooted in humility and attentive listening. He viewed his journey as a ladder into mystery, where each question was upheld by prayer and each discovery became an occasion for thanksgiving. Today, as the world continues to struggle between scientific progress and spiritual crisis, that legacy still resounds as an invitation. Let intellect be illuminated by faith, and let faith open the boundless horizon of reason. From the light of his life, the believer perceives the inner heartbeat of a master who knew how to live fully the harmony between creation and the Creator. That legacy becomes a foundation in our own era as humanity seeks to understand the world amid constant change. St. Albert the Great reminds us that science and theology are not two diverging lines, but two currents flowing toward the same ocean of God's mystery. O St. Albert the Great, in this silent moment, I lift my heart with you and offer a prayer to God. Please intercede for the Church to live in the harmony you embodied, so that pastors and believers may love truth, respect knowledge, and place every discovery under the light of faith. May the Church become a place where humanity finds peace, where science is uplifted by hope, and where faith becomes the lantern that guides through the darkness of the world. O Holy Saint, please guard the souls who are seeking truth. People are standing at the crossroads of life, carrying great questions about meaning and direction. Help them find humility in learning. Help them know that intellect opens fully only when illuminated by the Spirit, and that even the smallest details of creation can become signs of God's kindness. In a world filled with turmoil, as war, division, and anxiety spread, I ask St. Albert the Great to intercede for peace. May nations recover their common voice and learn to dialogue with respect. May our leaders receive the gift of wisdom to resolve the crises of our age. May lands wounded by violence be healed. May families living in tension find understanding so that love may bloom again amid deep wounds. Lord, through the intercession of St. Albert the Great, help us see the world through the light of the sacred creation you made. Help us cherish the small beauties of life, walk with humble hearts and open minds. Lead us into the wisdom that only you can give. And in that journey, may we find peace, so that the light of truth may guide us back to you, the source of all life and all understanding. I bless all brothers and sisters who clicked like on this video. May God, through the intercession of the saints, grant you peace, health, and abundant grace in your life. Return to the tabernacle, return to the light of the Holy Eucharist, return to the silent companionship with the one who waits for us in the sacrament of love. And if in what I shared today you found one or two sentences that touched your soul and helped you come closer to God, then I am satisfied.